A special presentation, Race in Louisville.
Good evening to you all. I'm Eric King. Thanks so much for joining us for another special presentation examining race in Louisville. For the next hour, WLKY will bring you a commercial-free, in-depth discussion in examining the critical racial issues facing our community. Tonight, we've assembled an experienced panel to talk about the issue of gun violence in our community and finding solutions to the growing problem. So let's introduce them now, and I'll do this slowly so everyone gets their first bit of face time here. First, we have Dr. Brandy Kelly Pryor, Director of the Center for Health Equality at the Louisville Metro Department of Public Health and Wellness. She's also an assistant professor at U of L's Public Health and Information Sciences. Next, we have Metro Councilman David James, a former LMPD detective who's represented District 6 since 2010. He's also serves as the chair of the Metro Council Public Safety Committee. Seated next is Trinidad Jackson, a senior research associate with the Office of Public Health Practice at the University of Louisville. And the next, Levon Morris, works with the Louisville Urban League as a community outreach worker. And also here tonight is the Honorable Brian Edwards, who has served as a Jefferson County Circuit Court judge since 2009. Prior to becoming a judge, he practiced law for 13 years. So, Judge, let's start with you. Let's kind of go around the table and assess the problem of gun violence. You're on the bench every day. How big of a problem is it from your view?
It's a huge problem. Too many guns in the community, too many guns in the hands of young people. And, there's been a lot of discussion about problem solving, conflict resolution skills. And you add those problems, you add guns into that mix and the readily accessibility of guns into that mix. And you get the problem that we're seeing now. You have too many young people who have difficulty handling their emotions, difficulty dealing with what we, as we get older, would identify as very minor things, minor beefs, and you put guns in their hands, and they make really poor decisions that become catastrophic decisions.
Levon, you mentioned almost that exact same thing when we started, people and the difficulty in problem solving among young people.
Yeah, biggest thing that I have, in my opinion, that I think is just, the young people, they don't see the bigger picture, and a lot of them have bright futures and have a lot of potential, but just because of the lack of knowledge, knowing, that if I could just say, I'm gonna leave this incident alone right here. All right, just because you said F my mom, F your dead little cousin, words can't hurt me, and once people can just kind of put pride to the side and understand that they're just words. A lot of this is coming from just people man, F your peoples, F my peoples. Next time I see you, if it's a lot of people around, I want some attention, so let's get it on.
Trinidad, it seems like in the news business, whenever we start a story about a homicide, we always say it started with a verbal altercation, which is what these two gentlemen talked about. Are you on board with that, or is there more to it?
I think it's, we talk about violence in general, it's definitely more to it. Just facilitated a focus group with some youth last night in Park Hill, and I'm sure many people have heard of the sayings, and I've heard it both ways, that people don't kill people, guns kill people, and then the other, guns don't kill people, people kill people. And so some of the commentary from the youth was around it actually being the person who's doing the killing with the gun. And so if we start it and we hone in on the individual problems that drive the violence, that's a part of it, but someone here mentioned the big picture. And so for me, the big picture is around power and how power is historically facilitated in this country around capitalism, colonialism, and paternalism. And so when you start looking at how those things have structured the United States based on violence, based on coming here and killing, using weapons to kill and colonize, and what that does and what that has done to our country and our norms over the span of these hundreds of years, that's the backstory that doesn't get dissected. And that thinking, applied to policy solutions when we're talking about legislation around gun violence. So,
David, Trinidad mentioned a word that stuck out to me, which was power. Going to put you in the hot seat here. You've been in power a number of years, from Metro Council to being a Metro police officer, police detective. How big of a problem is gun violence from the seats in which you've been?
It's a huge problem. It affects our families. It affects people. It affects our ability to attract businesses. It affects the budget of the city significantly. Tonight we're going to be voting on a Metro Council budget of $6.2 million, with about $2.1 million of that going directly towards violence reduction. The number of people that have been shot in our community, almost 500 people have been shot in our community. That's 500 people that have significant medical injuries, 500 people that are not able to support their families now, 500 people that are affecting their other family members by that violence. And so it spreads across the entire community. Whether it happened next door to you or not, you're affected by it.
One of the things that has come up this year, and Dr. Pryor, I think this is actually the first year where I've heard of the shootings and the gun violence being looked at as a public health epidemic. I know by education you've been looking at this for a long time, but it's new to a lot of us. How much of a public health epidemic is gun violence?
Yes. So about 30 years ago, that's when the CDC as well as Congress really started to talk about this as a public health issue. And when we talk about public health, we're talking about how does it impact the lifestyle, the quality of life, the livability of a community. And if we start to think about what epidemics have looked like in other areas when we've had cholera outbreaks or the AIDS epidemic, it really is driven by fear. It's driven by a lot of biases. And so that is when we talk about public health as being a part of this gun violence right now. We're looking at the whole ecology of the environments in which we live in. As Trinidad was speaking before, there's the individual that is at the core of that ecological model, which we call the social ecological model, and something that the Center for Disease Control uses to look at violence as a public health issue. But it stems out to what are the policies and the practices, what are the structural violences that people have had to endure by living in communities that have not had economic development, that are oppressed. And so that oppression in and of itself has dealt with people having assaulted dignity. You know, you were mentioning about the verbal abuse that happens in communities. To think that for one to have power, they can just hold on to the dignity that I have has been so assaulted by these other factors in my life that now I'm going to take a gun and exhibit that power in another way. So the public health model is looking at all of those systems and how all of those systems work together, not just the individual behavior, not just the person who has shot the gun, but where are we even producing guns in our community?
So are those systems, in your opinions, working together the way that they should? Because by nature of the number of homicides that we've had in this city this year, historic, that would somewhat imply that they're not.
Well, I want to follow up on the public health angle of this, and one of the things that I think that we need to be conscious of is looking at the mental health aspect, the mental health consequences of so much of this gun violence. When you talk about young people witnessing someone get shot right in front of them, a 7-year-old, 8-year-old, watching their dad, their uncle, their friend, their brother killed right in front of them, and expecting that this person is going to be able to move forward in life, go forward, go to school the next day. That's unrealistic. And but far too often I see folks who come before me in court who've been subjected to all kinds of trauma in their life, who've seen all kinds of things that you know most of us would never ever want to see, and they've never talked to anybody on a professional level about this. They've never had any assistance grieving loss of a friend or a relative, and these things build up inside of people. And you know, when I was working out at the University of Louisville, we were researching, doing a lot of work about mental health problems, particularly within the black community. PTSD, untreated mental health, untreated depression, And I think by thinking about these things, by providing resources in these areas on the front end, potentially we can help mitigate some of the problems that are gonna manifest themselves with these individuals 5, 6, 7 years down the road.
From what you've seen, when you throw the term mental health out there in the African American community, maybe this question is coming from ignorance, but it seems like for years, when you talk about PTSD and reaction to seeing something so violent, it seems like for a lot of families, mental health has to take a back burner because it's basically crazy versus not crazy. Mm-hmm. And so from your perspective, are you seeing people who are dealing with these types of PTSD and these types of disorders, do they even realize that they're dealing with these types of disorders?
They don't. There's a stigma still associated with it, particularly in the black community. And a lot of times the resources just might not be there. And not until a child does something in school that might get referred somewhere will they ever have an opportunity to actually sit down with somebody who can help them process through what they've dealt with. But no, I don't think it's being treated, don't think it's being dealt with on the front end very well at all.
Levon, I can't help but notice that you have someone that I believe is close to you around your neck. Mm. What's the backstory there? And as it pertains to what he was saying about being treated for having experienced or seen such a terrible trauma?
I mean, kind of what Mr. Edwards was saying about just the whole fact that a lot of them, the lack of knowledge on knowing that when something happens, what's next? You know, because a lot of them have broken homes, come from broken homes, broken communities. So the way in the stuff that we're taught, you only really, if it makes sense, I'm sure everyone probably agree, you only do and stuff what you see. So if I grew up seeing people just doing negativity and I have no one behind me supporting me to be able to say, well, hey, you know, I know you might just seen that, but hey, we don't want you to go that way. Let's just keep pushing this way.
But you have someone around your neck that I believe was a victim of gun violence. Was it someone close to you?
It's my best friend.
Were you able to, how were you able to move past that in a healthy way, or were you?
I mean, actually, I still deal with it on a day-to-day basis, but I mean, I was fortunate enough to be able to understand that when stuff like this happens, you can't take two more steps backwards. You know, you got to turn a negative into a positive. And so, you know, with that, and I knew as being a community leader, I couldn't react to it how I might wanted to mentally when it first happened, you know. So after just grieving and, you know, talking and just seeing the impact that he had on the city, you know, like just seeing, you know, that it was thousands of people at the wake and funeral, you know, like just seeing how much of a legend, just of him being 20, I think he was 22 at the moment, or 23, I think. And, you know, it was scary. Like, it was so many people to where I was like, I didn't know he had that much of an influence. And so that made me just be like, well, okay, well, at least for the community, we can try to change the community and try to, so this wouldn't transfer to negativity. And so, you know, that's what inspired me to start my nonprofit, which I started a nonprofit called Hope by Hope. And that was the inspiration of losing him. And so, I mean, like I said, I'm still dealing with it, and I'm still actually, you know, dealing with his parents and nephews, and his brother was incarcerated, you know what I'm saying, for like 4 years of his life. You know, it was just them two. So his brother got out a day after he was killed. So that type of stuff, I'm dealing with families. I'm trying to, you know, just be their support, you know, positive. So if pretty much I'm still dealing with it in a positive mindset, and I'm gonna stay positive, you know, because I know it's what he would want. And so for the younger ones who's looking at it as in revenge or retaliation, like I'm trying to put stuff on their mind where they can see the bigger picture, so they can have a future, they can have more dreams, they can push through instead of looking at it like I lost a legend, so let's take somebody else's legend. Let's do this and that. You know, I don't care about nothing no more. A lot of people, like, he has so much influence where a lot of people actually be like, you know, forget a lot of stuff. You know, school, like his nephew, like just certain stuff. Like he had just said, forget school, a 7-year-old, you know, like, and I had to, you know, because he was very intelligent, but just the fact of losing someone that close to him, he just shut down. And that's what a lot of people do. They just kind of shut down, and they need more people around them to kind of influence them, motivate them, pull them through. Because, I mean, it's a hard battle out here with the battle we facing on the global scale and the battle that we're facing in our community, losing brothers every day. I mean, if I lost, I mean, that wasn't the first one that I had. I lost, in 2012, I lost a sister leaving the club, you know, Cheryl Williamson, innocent, you know, like just walking out of the club and an altercation transpired, and she was the one who got shot. So, I mean, it's been like, I mean, kind of back to what he said, like, I mean, there's a lot of people who let it just build in, you know, and I think that's where people go wrong, Gary. Like, maybe even if it's just talking to a friend, you know, like a lot of people let it just build up to where when an incident happens, it's just a reaction. You know, and that's sometimes that's mental illness, because if you just letting something build up and it's negative, you seeing somebody get shot, you watching your mom get beat, you watching your dad smoke pot, you watching all your friends drop out of school. I mean, what's positive around you? So if you walk up on me talking about F Drizzy, then it's over. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's how a lot of them is looking at it, you know, and they don't have the mental capacity to look at it like it's just words. I bro wouldn't want, you know. So if that kind of answers your question.
It answers a lot of questions, actually. I think you brought it home in a way that a lot of people have struggled to do for a very long time. And Dr. Pryor, is this the level of trauma that is consistent through gun violence victims?
I think, you know, both what Judge Edwards and Levon are saying are so powerful to think about how individuals are dealing with trauma on a daily basis. And if we had more judges that were trauma informed, you know, before people came before them and were able to say, you know, I can see the root causes that have led you to the path to be in front of me. If we had more police officers that had understanding and awareness of what trauma is doing, what post-traumatic stress is doing. Post-traumatic stress from seeing something happen in your home, such as domestic violence, a form of violence that then leads people to other areas of violence in the future. So that is really critically important, and I think what we're hearing is that it takes all of us. When we just talk about this as being a police issue or just our criminal justice issue, we're not focusing on early childhood educators and how critically important they are to making sure that we don't have someone who is engaging in homicide in the future. I think another issue that we oftentimes go to is it is the problem of the person, and we pathologize that person or that community, and we don't take into account, as Levon is saying, you know, we see all of these things that might be happening in our community, but then if you don't have a grocery store to go to, and then if you don't have a bank that you can put your money in, or if you're being told by your news and your social media around you that your community is already negative, those are all areas of systematic violence that are happening on top of someone who's dealing with the individual violence in their communities as well.
David, it's a privilege to be able to pick your brain since you've been from Metro Police to now the Metro Council, so I imagine you have a lot of insight on this. One of the things that Dr. Pryor mentioned was people saying there needs to be more police. Well, we're about to get them. That's coming. From your opinion, is that something that would help? And also, as a police officer, were you trained along the lines of recognizing PTSD and some of the mental troubles that the people on the panel have mentioned so far?
I think that having more police officers will help. You know, the city of Louisville has had a shortage of police officers for quite some time, but I don't want us to believe that the police are going to be the only answer. It's all the things that we're talking about here. It's simply not a police issue, but yes, it will help. The issue about police officer training and understanding trauma that's associated with the people they're dealing with, I think that we do some training in that area, but I don't think that we do enough in that area. And I say that as I was listening to this conversation. We had a conversation not very long ago in the mayor's office, and we were talking about how when a child is in a home of domestic violence and the police are there that day, then the police make an effort to contact the school the next day so some therapy can be provided to that child. But if a child is in the neighborhood where a shooting's taken place, or they've seen their uncle or their brother or their best friend killed, nothing. We don't contact the school system as a city and say, this is a problem. And so what ends up happening is the child ends up acting out because they're grieving. The school system then calls the police, and the child ends up being a part of the system. And so I think that's something that we really have to address and fix. I hope that answers.
It does. You know, did I cut someone off?
I just was going to say that just a good point to kind of what they both, I think you mentioned it too, just the alignment of everyone's work. If everyone's work is just aligned just a little bit, because I know everyone's busy and, you know, got their own life and schedule, but if just the alignment, like of a judge and a councilman and a health and community leader and community, like just can all be making decisions that's affecting all communities, not just, hey, we're gonna focus on this one community, and then in Shawnee and Smoketown, if we focus on Russell right now and then just Russell for the whole year, then Shawnee and Smoketown is getting overlooked, and then it's still the same, almost the same violence going on there. So I just think people from each community have to get aligned, you know, and everyone has to be on the same page, because I mean, like he's saying, with more officers, it will be a decrease. But then what about the relationship with the officers in the community?
Exactly.
You know, so I just wanted to mention that because it was fresh on me.
And to that point, I think we're so poised right now. We're in a new space where we're about to get new officers. We know that from evidence-based that an increase in officers does not decrease crime. But
that's research.
That is. But what we are able to do is if we use innovative new practices with these police officers that are coming in, then perhaps we will reduce crime. So I think if we go back to the 1970s when there was an influx in crime in the Nixon administration, there was a lot of rhetoric about getting tough on crime. There was a rise in the amount of police officers that were put on the street. Crime went up. And so I think we're at a place now we can learn from that history and that link in the past and say, how are we going to make sure that these these police officers that are coming in are truly community agents on the street, and that they can help be interrupters of the violence the same way that we can have community members, so that when you see a person in a uniform, you can get really excited. I mean, I think we have some amazing officers on our force, both men and women, who are doing amazing work in the community. Let's highlight that by making sure that they all come in with that same understanding about these wraparound services, and that you don't have to be armed to go into the school to prevent violence there, that bullying, that social media, that verbal abuse, that are all these perhaps root causes that are also embedded in systems and communities in which people are not being able to really tie into services and social services and supports that will help lift them up.
You know, I think more officers certainly is a good thing, and it's important to make sure that we have those resources out there. But I think perhaps more important, and following up on what you all both said, is that we have officers who have a real relationship within the community, who the community feel that they can trust. Because when I look at cases that have come before me, that the prosecutors will bring a case, and, you know, there may be a crime, a murder that takes place. There may be it can take place in broad daylight. Everybody knows who did it. But if people don't come to court and want to come forward and be witnesses, then that case will never be solved, and they fall apart. And it happens every day. We've seen it, and I think there's two problems. The first is the obvious problem of fear of retaliation. People don't want to get involved, and they don't want to put themselves out there, and I think we can all appreciate that. But a second problem is when the police are coming to a neighborhood where they are not respected or trusted, asking for the community to help them, the community's not going to help them, because they're like, we don't trust you. You haven't been treating us right. And I hear that from witnesses. I hear that from people frequently. And that's something that can be addressed simply by developing better relationships between law enforcement and the community, so that the community feels that they are working with law enforcement as opposed to working against law enforcement in solving these crimes. Because the community, I think there's a misperception. The communities don't want this happening. People who live in these communities, the vast majority of them are law-abiding citizens, and they don't like what's going on. And there's a small segment of folks that are causing these problems, and the community wants them out.
Well, this is the difficult question, because you mentioned some people don't want to contact police and because of different trust issues. But when you're looking at a homicide rate like we have this year, historic, and a large number of those homicides are not solved. And it sounds like what you're saying is there are people out there who know the answer to these crimes but aren't coming forward for various reasons. How then does the whole anonymous tip line play into this? Because we push it every day. If you know something, you saw something, say something, you can do it anonymously. Why then, with that level of protection, are people still not saying anything and these crimes still going unsolved?
In addition to whatever your response may be, I want to quickly respond to you saying that that's a level of protection. I know people who have called anonymous tip lines and their anonymity hasn't been secured. So that's one thing that plays into whether
I don't think a lot of people know that.
And I think secondly, though, quickly, is that with that, I mean, just because you give anonymous tip doesn't mean that the case will be solved, because you still got to show up.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? You got to show up, be there every court date just about that you're required to be there. So if you come and you miss a court date, or you come and you change up your story, you're not valid.
I would, and David, you could probably speak to this better than I, but I would bet that a large number of those unsolved homicides, if you took detectives in the homicide unit and you say, who did this, they could probably tell you who did it, but they can't bring the case. They can't make the case.
Because when the person calls into the anonymous tip line, they may say, I was there. I saw John shoot Jack. Well, can you give me your name? I'd like to talk to you. And no, I'm not giving you my name. Yeah. And so in the end, unless there's other information that the police can use to corroborate what they've been told, then that's just information they have. And they can't use that to prosecute in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt.
So what's
right? So it shouldn't be called an anonymous tip line if indeed what we need to push a case further is your information to identify you to prosecute someone who may have committed a crime. So that's misleading at the outset of that system.
So with that said, what's the fix? I mean, how do you get these murders solved? If you have detectives in theory that know who did it, but are on some level unable to prove it without people coming forward and serving as public witnesses who don't want to, I mean, are we at a roadblock? Are we stuck?
Well, it's not always that. You can be anonymous. And I would beg to differ a little bit. You can be anonymous.
Based on your personal experience.
Yes. You can be anonymous if you choose to be. But if they ask you the question, who are you and what's your name, and you tell, then you're not anonymous, okay? When you call in on the tip line, it doesn't identify you. There's no caller ID. And so you're anonymous until you make yourself not anonymous.
So I think your question about is there a fix, one of the things that, when we're trying to develop policies or get to root causes of things, exercises to ask why 5 times. And so if we take this anonymous tip line and we're saying, well, why don't people want to actually come forward? Is there a level of retaliation that's happening in communities? Are there an inability to trust the process in the criminal justice system to actually make sure that people who are perhaps dangerous and or committing these heinous and violent crimes, not someone who perhaps has sold drugs in the community and now the escalation of issues, but we really need to get to why are these things happening in the way that they are. And oftentimes we put it on the victims and or communities that have been victimized as this is your fault, and the reason that we can't solve crimes is because you're not coming forward, when I think we need to dig a little bit deeper into what are those structural issues that those communities are challenged by.
When we look at gun violence, your thoughts, is this a community-wide thing or is it specific to certain neighborhoods? And I ask that because, interestingly enough, earlier in the week, the mayor said something along the lines of, we have to stop acting like it's easy to grow up in all neighborhoods. Some neighborhoods are more difficult. And with that said, just looking through the statistics of the shootings that have happened this year, I'll throw this out there, 74% of the shooting victims have been black. 80% of them have been men. More than half are 25 or younger. And the most shootings happen in the Russell neighborhood, followed by Shawnee, then California. Is this a community-wide thing, or is this limited?
Well, I think it affects the entire community. But if you talk about the 1st Police Division, the 2nd Police Division, and the 4th Division, which are the areas that you've just spoke of, when you combine all the homicides from those divisions for this year, at this point, the number is 83. That's more homicides than we had in the entire city last year. So there is a certain part of the city that is more impacted by others, but there have been shootings all over the county. But there are a concentrated area where they are taking place.
Let's talk about solutions. One of the things that we brought up before we started talking on camera here was about the need for various resources and programs. How big of a deal is that?
A huge deal. It's a lot of resources and programs out there, and there's a lot of citizens who need it. And I just feel like the disconnect comes from each other. It may be the citizens. Some of it's the citizens' fault because a lot of Americans are lazy. And so, we just got this mindset of sitting in the house, playing the game, being on the phone all day. It's a different world now. Technology is ruling. So a lot of stuff is just, you can just sit around and take care of a lot of your business just being sitting around. And I just feel like a lot of the resources, they're not connecting. So I just feel like it is huge because teenagers need to be utilizing so they can see in the future what way they want to go. Like a lot of them don't even know. They don't know they want to be an entrepreneur, want to be a doctor, a nurse, a lawyer, a judge, because they so blinded about what's going on right now, what they see every day, to where, the role models, the community leaders, they're not, in these communities that's needed, they're not standing up. And so they're going to have to be the ones who connect the resources, because it's proven that the resources are not coming to the trenches. They're not. And and that's the part of it too. Like, people need to see people in the trenches. Like, a lot of people say they care, but the people's not in the trenches. So I just feel like the programs, for a solution in my opinion, for the police and the citizens. Like, when I was growing up, I mentioned earlier PAL League, which stands for Police Athletic League. And when I was growing up, we was playing 1st district versus 5th district, 2nd district versus,
like intra-community sports.
Yeah, soccer. I even played soccer. Mr. Charles Jones, he's still on the force now. I played soccer, I played, we did different intramural sports, but the biggest key was, you finding people from Victory Park, Shawnee, California, they coming to Mazik playing. We're going down to Western playing, we're going to Shawnee playing. And that's why I know everybody, I feel comfortable going anywhere, and it's a lot going on, but I feel comfortable going anywhere. And so it's needed, and that'll be a way to, because, it's police officers that I see still to this day, have a full-blown conversation with. And it's like, that's the connection that a lot of people, and I know robbers, killers, and all types of prior people that actually will see these same people and say, hey, how you doing, Miss Lisa? How you doing, Mr. Charles? How you doing, Miss Pam? Those was officers that was there when we was growing up, and a lot of them even mentioning, I heard people mention, where's the PAL League, and
does it not exist anymore?
It doesn't exist, and they said it doesn't exist because of funding. And so that's a disconnect. I feel like, how is it doesn't exist because of funding? We didn't get fed. We didn't go on no trips. All we did was show up to play basketball.
And we're happy to do it.
Yeah. So I'm stepping out. I will run it. I talked to Mr. Fisher the other day about it. That's something I want to do, and that's a connection from the police to the community. But even like Metro Parks, the funding is being cut, and they're not able to access as many as programs and stuff that they used to. And even growing up in Smoketown, we have no gym. Both of my projects got torn down. Well, my facilities that I played basketball in, East Louisville and Presbyterian Community Center. And I'm from Shelby Park. So me growing up, that's what I had. East Louisville, Presbyterian Community Center and Walnut Street Baptist Church. Walnut Street's they don't even have enough to really keep their lights on. They don't have no programs going on in Walnut Street. PCC's torn down, East Louisville's torn down. So we have no gyms. 2 years ago, I had 20 kids outside playing basketball, and it was a drive-by that happened. I had a 9-year-old little boy get shot. I think about that every day. Like, I don't even feel safe taking kids to the park now. Like, it's 20 kids out here, and we playing basketball at 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
So is it fair if I ask you what you're describing based on your past experiences of talking about people coming together for good fellowship and activity, whether we hooping or whether we doing whatever.
Yeah.
People just coming together,
Bringing it
no
back.
problems,
Up,
none of that. And so you also mentioned people being in certain environments and doing what they see, which are the norms around them. And you asked earlier, are our systems working collectively as they should be to annihilate some of the gun problems and the violence associated with that? And so if I go back to the system or systems issue that facilitate many of these problems, I'm looking at historical housing policies that intentionally placed poor people and black people in concentrated areas of poverty with dump sites. I'm thinking about the education system, and that was a preliminary conversation we had about education. But for me specifically, I'm thinking about content that is facilitated. So we're sitting in classrooms and we're being imparted with information that's teaching us what to think. It's not teaching us how to think, it's teaching us how to behave in a capitalistic system. So not problem solving with regards to issues surrounding humanity or issues that we're discussing. We're learning calculus in 2 + 2. And so if the focus in school from when we were yay high was on issues of humanity versus teaching to a test, then I don't think we would have sustained legacies of slavery that we have. When I think about the criminal justice system and the profit margins that are of interest that go along with mass incarceration and what that does to a Russell community, to a Beecher community, wherein it's profitable for them to go to jail. That's what I'm thinking about for these people. When we think about the education system, and additionally, not only am I not being taught things, or my learning isn't being facilitated in an empowering way, there's also this thing called the school to prison pipeline. And so, again, looking at what that does to the capitalistic sentiments of America, that says we don't give a damn about the kids in school. We don't give a damn about these communities in Beecher Terrace. We give a damn about profits. And so if we keep going back to the individual problems and only leaving it there, then we're not addressing the historical, the rooted issues that facilitate and are sustaining the current problems. And, you know, when I grow up in a neighborhood and this is all I see, well, it's research and anecdotally, you know, within our office, the office I work within, we talk about knowing and understanding your history. So if I'm born into a ghetto, right? We're on welfare. My uncle has went to prison. My brother's been shot, etc. I go to school. I'm targeted because of my race, and I'm suspended majority of the times for things that I do that are unwarranted. I'm looking at that as like, that's my life. But nah, this is all of these things converge for something intentional for you based on the spectrum of your skin color. And so when I begin to understand that critically understand that these things are being facilitated for my intentional demise, then I say, oh, I can do something about that because this is something that's actively and intentionally being done. So how can I actively and intentionally resist against that? And so if we're teaching people how to actively resist and organize against the status quo, then the sentiments of capitalism and colonialism will be destroyed. And that's not what the sentiment of white supremacy wants.
How overwhelming is that then? I'll ask you, Councilman, and you, Judge, because from a legislative point of view and from a legal point of view, when you take 200 years worth of history and oppression into account, well, now you have to legislate and you have to sentence. How do you look as far back as you took us? How do you take that and move forward and enact policies that are able to fix what's happening today?
I'll start. I think part of it we could talk about, you know, as I talked about the budget we're passing tonight, and we were just talking earlier, one of the things that we're building into the budget is a chief equity officer for the city of Louisville that looks exactly at those things, those systems that we have in place that address those issues.
Will this be the first time the city would have such a thing?
Yes, it will. And then when we talk about the Powell Basketball League, in that budget today that would be passed today is the money to start a peace basketball league, which is firefighters and police officers coaching neighborhood leagues all across the city. And so, you know, we're working on those things.
And Judge, you know, when someone stands before you and you have to issue a sentence, if there's a conviction, how do you take into consideration all the things that Trinidad brought up, but you're looking at things through the eyes of the law? You know, a crime was committed and someone was convicted. You know, do you have the latitude to take into consideration a person's history versus, hey, this is the mandatory sentence for this crime?
Well, certain crimes I don't have a lot of latitude. So, you know, crimes involving serious physical injury, involving usage of a handgun, I don't have a lot of latitude there. You're not eligible for probation. Those are considered violent offenses, and if I probated somebody or if I reduce the sentence, I'm going to get reversed. So I don't have a lot of latitude on sentencing. But I want to talk about those other offenses where I do have some discretion. When someone comes before me for sentencing, I have a report. It's called a pre-sentence report. It has their background, tells me everything from whether they have a tattoo and what that tattoo says, to where they graduated from school, if they graduated from school, what grade they last completed, what their criminal history is, if they have substance abuse issues, if they have mental health issues. All this is in this report. Now, obviously, the report is only as good as the sources that provide that information, but we rely upon that pretty heavily. At least I do when I sentence someone. And I'm always cognizant of the big picture when I'm sentencing somebody. If somebody is going to go to prison, I'm cognizant of the fact that they're going to get out, and it's not going to be that long, and they're going to go back to the same community that they were in when they went in. And I'm cognizant of the fact that this person may need some assistance with mental health issues, with substance abuse issues, with just life issues. So when I'm fashioning a sentence, I don't like it to be a black and white cookie cutter type thing. I like to do it individually for each individual that comes before me. I encourage the attorneys to come up with what we call an alternate sentencing plan, to give me some options, you know, something that's like a real options. You know, I don't want to just sit up there and say, okay, get a job, don't use drugs, don't have a gun. It's unrealistic, and it's naive for me to do that. I like to put some things in place that may help them, give them the tools to do those things. There's some good programs out there, and Corrections has a program now called the Day Reporting Center, and it's some folks that work in the jail, and they communicate. And when I say they communicate, they really talk to the folks that come through this program. Talk to them about life. Talk to them about the challenges that they're going to face now that they have this conviction on their record. Put them in contact with resources like the Urban League. The Urban League does great work helping people get jobs, helping people re-enter the community. But give them the actual tools that they're going to need to do the things that I need them to do. So those are the types of things that I like to do. All of what you were talking about is dead on. You got folks who sometimes they don't know what they don't know, you know, when they're sitting there. And I can't rely upon this light switch to go off with them and that they're going to turn everything around. Sadly, oftentimes I can't rely upon their family. to help them. I see people, and one of the saddest things that I see is a young person coming into court looking at maybe a 10 to 15 year sentence, and he's coming in for sentencing with no one in the courtroom, not a friend, not a family member, nobody is there, you know. And I'm like, wow, I can't imagine what that must be like. You about to go away for a good chunk of time, and there's nobody there just to support them. And you see them sometimes when they're in custody. They come out of that door and they look into the gallery and they're looking for somebody. There's no one there, and you know, that's tough. That's tough. So I think is a part of the criminal justice system, is a community, we need to sometimes step in to the shoes of the folks, for the folks that don't have anybody there, and to help give them the tools that they are going to need to turn this thing around and make better decisions.
So Mike,
I was just going back to those relationships and that social network. It is so critical. I don't know, a few years ago there was the affluenza case, and the young man who, you know, his social network allowed him not to have to face the same punishment or crime that someone who does not have someone who's with them in the courtroom would have to face. And so I think when we think about this, we are so concentrated on that individual and not those systems and networks that, as Trinidad was talking about, over 200 years have been built for people. These networks of what judge do I know? What lawyer do I know? What teacher do I know? What banker or loan officer do I know that can help me get out of a situation? You asked how do we legislate this? The city right now, we have a grant from an organization called Living Cities, and they are partnering with a Center for Social Inclusion. And one of the best practices that we see out of some of the other cities in the country that are doing this well is that we can use racial equity tools to be able to apply to all of our programs, our policies, and our practices. One of the examples that was used is they were finding that in a particular community, there were a lot of homicides in that community, and also the streetlights did not work in that community. And so as they applied this tool, they started to recognize and understand that the street lights, the way that they needed to call in for the street lights to be fixed, were not a common norm or practice that had happened in that community the ways they were happening in the other communities that they were getting fixed. As soon as they fixed the street lights, the homicides went down.
So just a simple change in the aesthetic.
A simple change in the aesthetic. But largely, it's really taking into consideration and the factors of how have certain communities dealt with particular oppressions. We are the Center for Health Equity and not the Center for Health Equality, because we talk about certain communities have been systematically more oppressed than others. And so we need to raise that bar, or we need to raise that level playing field for everybody. We didn't all start at the same point. And so because we haven't all started at the same point, certain communities are going to be able to enter into this process differently.
And so looking at something such as a toolkit that can help you make proactive preventive decisions in favor of marginalized communities, and looking at what you do when you say, you know, cases come across my desk and I attempt to look at the big picture, and I encourage prosecutors or whoever you said, I encourage them to take things into consideration. My question is then, how can we, one, utilize a person such as yourself in movements that are pro-black life or pro-marginalized life? How can we use a person such as yourself to inform organizers and community members on what they need to do to engage in advocacy and creation of policy that doesn't make it optional for you to encourage someone to consider big picture ideas, or for you yourself as a judge to have the option to encourage, but that's something standard. And there's a standardized process and sustained education that's implemented for people in the criminal justice system who are facilitating all of these lifelong and life-impacting decisions for those who come before them. Because, for example, we're looking at Flint and what's going on with that water crisis. And so we have hundreds of youth and adults but hundreds of youth who are negatively impacted and who will have lifelong impacts with lead poisoning. Okay, and so what are the biological and the psychological impacts of lead poisoning? Many of those are behavioral. So you display disruptive behavior, signs of ADHD, defiant disorder, PTSD, etc. So many of these, as we talked about mental health issues and how they manifest in society, many of those things that lead poisoning facilitates in a person, when they display that behavior in public, that translates to you're a misfit. You're operating outside of the norm and you need to be punished. Additionally, if you're coming from an environment of poverty and all you've seen is a negative lifestyle in which you are expected to participate, all of that's a perfect storm for the consistent demise and destruction, again, of a community. And so we're talking about the city of Flint right now. And we're talking about hundreds of lives who are going to be impacted in this way. And are those the critical questions that we're asking? Are we creating a proactive and preventive plan to protect those people who are negatively impacted by lead poisoning? And it's going to manifest in such ways, which goes back to criminal justice, which stemmed from poverty, which stemmed from, colonization. Why is this group of people specifically living in this geographic area that's been poisoned, knowingly poisoned?
You know, those are all things that, I guess the short answer is, those are all things that I would need to know, that any judge would want to know, if somebody, that they're mitigating factors as to why somebody did something. And they're gonna impact my decision and hopefully any thoughtful judge's decision. But looking forward, you know, then I need to know, okay, how are we going to address these problems? Okay, what resources are out there? What programs are out there? What can we do to address these problems so that now that I'm okay, I understand this may have impacted why this person landed here. How can we keep them from coming back? Okay, how can we address these issues? And that's where the entire community has to come together. The entire community has to step up, be it, you know, somebody coaching, somebody talking to someone working in the mental health field and in the health field working, folks in legislative positions. We all have to come together and work, folks in the media, and educate the community about what these resources are and how we can connect them to the individuals that most need them.
I mean, because one thing I just think, because that's a great point, and I mean, but because speaking from the people's perspective, they don't think that it's people like you or even like you who will come down to talk to them, just have random discussions of like, yeah, I am aware of what's going on, I am aware of the history, you know, but we all got to play our roles and factors to get to shaping it, because it takes all of us to raise one village, you know what I'm saying? It's not going to start with just me doing my work in Smoketown, you working in your district, and you doing what you do every day. And, you know, yes, you helping, we all helping people in our own ways, but if we can all come together and do it consistently, not just, I mean, because once a month's great, but if we could, outside of getting on the global scale, we can have our individual meetings and where we getting here and going to community centers and maybe even the neighborhood association meetings might be a good way to start, where we all can just start going there, you know, once a month. I mean, because once the people can see that, like, dang, Mr. James, he know Lee and he know Trinidad, and, you know, hold on, you know, it's a whole different approach when they see it too. Like, they see us in the community, we doing neighborhood cleanups and we getting the actual community to participate, not bringing people who ain't never stepped a foot into that community to do that work. Why is somebody else cleaning up my community? You know what I'm saying? Like, that's how I look at it, you know, like, and so I just want to sneak in.
One of the best things about all of these panels is the fact that they go into so many different avenues and topics, and we can go all the way back through colonialization and see a modern day link. But I do want to bring it back to guns. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I would be remiss if I didn't at some point ask the question, the guns in our community, where are they coming from? Where are all of these guns coming from?
I actually met a guy from Oakland. I don't know. I mean, this is a story from Oakland. I just met him like last week, and he basically was telling me that the government left a whole lot of guns on the train, on like on the tracks. I wouldn't say the government. Someone left some on the tracks, and basically like it's for people to go break into them and get free guns, like where they get the guns and then just start selling them all through California. This is in California, one of the biggest states. And like he's literally like, I mean, he's a community activist, and we kind of met at the Rumble, Young Man Rumble, and we were just having general conversation. He was like, man, I know you know youngins that go to the crates and the trains and crack them open, and there's guns, and then they just start selling them all over the street.
And the trouble with something like that is, you know, we live in a world where so many people are debating back and forth between what's fake news and what's real news. We'd have to vet that, obviously, and see if that's true. Interesting, regardless. But as far as here, you know, other ideas.
Locally, we have a problem with people breaking into cars regularly to get guns for the purpose of getting guns out of people's cars and homes. We have the secondary market, meaning you can get on the internet, order a gun from a seller, but mostly from someone that's already purchased a gun, and they sell it, and they don't care how old you are or who you are. And if you look on social media, you'll see kids trading guns back and forth all the time. And so the guns are here, and the kids are buying them, and they're selling them, and they're trading them, and they're using them. We got stories about kids being paid anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000 to shoot people here in our neighborhood, in our community. And so it's a huge problem.
Mm-hmm.
Is the availability of guns somewhat tied up in the whole Second Amendment rights argument that has been consistent for 200 years?
Yes. I think so.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you have a community and that community is infested with drugs, you're going to come up with laws that say we're going to make it illegal, and we're going to put harsh penalties against anybody that is caught selling, distributing drugs in this community. And that's going to be one of many tactics that you use to get the drugs out of that community. Well, you see that same community that's infested with this gun violence. Logic tells you, well, let's come up with some laws that say anybody who is caught handing out, selling, swapping guns to people in this community, we're going to prosecute them. We're going to criminalize that. We don't have that. And that's directly, I think, a result of the Second Amendment, some of the protections. People don't want to criminalize if a grandparent wants to give a gun to his grandson so that they can go hunting, those types of things. And that's this. We could get into a whole nother discussion there. But to me, it seems illogical that someone can come into a community and distribute guns and not face consequences for that. But that's the situation that we have right now.
About 30 seconds. Last question goes to you. When gun sentences are so stringent, why are they not a deterrent?
For possession of a gun. But I'm talking about someone that wants to sell a gun to a minor, distribute guns. That's where there's a void in the law, at least at the state law level. There's a void. There's nothing there. We have possession of a handgun by a convicted felon. That's a felony. We have possession of a stolen firearm. That's a felony. Again, those are possession. But as far as selling guns, distributing guns to a minor, there's no deterrent.
What a controversial place to leave it. Guys, I got to tell you, we covered a lot of topics, went in depth on a lot of them, which I certainly appreciate. The benefit of these panels is to be able to take all of these issues and really do a deep dive, and I think we did that today. So I want to thank you, not just for being here, but for coming ready to play with perspectives and ideas, and we hope to continue the conversation with each and every one of you. And to you all, thank you for joining us. We hope you continue the conversation in your own homes and neighborhoods. We can all play a role in moving our city forward. For WLKY News, I'm Eric King. Good night.